pleased to welcome all of you to this talk, which is about Spatial Practices of Refuge. And we have here our main speaker, Dr. Sana Murrani. She will present her latest book, which is on Rupturing Architecture, Spatial Practices of Refuge in Response to War and Violence in Iraq between 2003 and 2023, which was published in 2024 by Bloomsbury. Sana will be presenting for around 30-40 minutes, and then she will be followed by a conversation with Professor Sana Murrani, who's over there. I'm sorry to say that one of our guest speakers, Professor Elena Fidian-Kazmi, couldn't make it today, but I'm sure the conversation will be as engaging as possible. I just want, before handing over to Sana, I wanted to briefly introduce her and Camillo, their biographies. So Dr. Sana Murrani is an associate professor in spatial practice. She's the founder of the Displacement Studies Research Network and the co-founder of the Justice and Imagination in Global Displacement Research Collective at the University of Cleveland. She's also a visiting senior fellow at the LSE Middle East Center. Sana's research interests are rooted in the interdisciplinarity of spatial justice, informed by a creative, place-based research practice that maps built, destroyed, remembered, and reimagined trauma, geographies of war, violence, and displacement. Professor Camillo Bano is Professor of Urban Design and Critical Theory at the Development Planning Unit, and since May 2020 also co-Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the Polytechnic of Turin in Italy. Camillo's research centers on the encounters between critical theory and urban design processes and the architecture of inhabitation. He's working on a series of interconnected research projects on urban infrastructures, habitability, people on the move, refugee spaces, and the urban project in Middle East, Latin America, and Europe. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming on this very cold, not very, very cold, but cold night in London. Actually, in Plymouth, it's lovely and sunny. I just left the sun and came here to speak to you. And this has been the work of a few years. I started working on this project just as COVID hit us. And quite a lot of things changed because of COVID, of course, and the way that the research was kind of done in that space. It was also influenced by different ways to work with people over and across different borders because I couldn't actually make it and go there. I'm just going to give a brief kind of background of what the book is about, but also I will start with a slight snippet on how I kind of broke in the book or put the book together. I use a lot of the work that I do speaks about spatial practice because it's a kind of a more encompassing word I find than to use the word architecture. So this is architecture as my background, but I really like this kind of play of what spatial practice kind of enables, which is an extension of more forms of architecture and urbanism and so on. And because I also operate across different scales, so my work kind of works with the scale of the architecture and the urban, but also I work a lot across borders. So this idea around how do we kind of deal with this from the material culture to the scale of the border was really part and parcel of how I started defining the architectures in multiplicity and how I work with the work with the project. Both Camillo and Elena actually were involved in the project in different capacities. So Elena wrote the foreword for my book, which I'm incredibly grateful for. It's a wonderful foreword. And I interviewed Camillo as part of the professional practitioners and researchers who have worked in similar kind of context. and I've known Camilla for quite some time, and we kind of had that conversation, and we'll probably extend the conversation later on. But the idea was that part of the work was to speak to Iraqis on the ground and understand how they coped across the past 20 years, but also to speak to practitioners to see how they've reflected on all of the, not just the 20 years, but also all types of trauma geographies within the Middle East in particular. So I use those two different words, which I will explain in a minute, but it's all kind of put together within a creative mapping methodology, which I kind of speak about the deep layers of mapping. And towards the end, the book ends with a manifesto of spatial justice, and it was intentionally that it ends with a message of hope, because there is so much, and I've heard a lot of people who've read the book say that it's actually quite intense to read because of the content of the memories and the stories within that. The book idea started back in 2022 when I got this funding from the British Academy for a project called Rupturing Domesticity. And the project was to document how Iraqis coped with war, but also how they responded at different scales within their built environment. And it was in partnership with the Middle East Centre, and that started the relationship with the Middle East Centre, which I still have until now, and there was another project that followed that afterwards. And it was also funded by the AHRC Impact Accelerator that followed that in 2023. There is a little barcode here for the visual archive of the work. So the book, if you do get your hands on a copy, it shows the maps and all of the visual work in black and white. And this is to reduce the price a little bit, but the Ruptured Domesticity website has all of the work, so you could have a look at that if you like. There was an exhibition of the work at the LSE Middle East Centre marking the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and this is really the starting point of the whole project. Is that point where I really wanted, as an architect, I wanted to really understand how Iraqis coped across the country in ways of responding to the trauma of war and violence. But I will also explain that the trauma of war and violence did not just start and stop with an invasion, but actually it had multiple kind of layers of trauma involved within that. And I will tell you a little bit about this. But in the nutshell, really the book, the project, and everything around the work that I do is this relationship between people and place. And in particular, when I kind of speak to people, it's always looking at the trauma, whether it's individual or collective, as well as memory, whether it's individual or collective. And I also speak, I mentioned this, the book goes through different scales of spatiality. So it starts with the material culture and home, and it moves into how the cities, and particularly Baghdad, which is where I'm from originally, has changed, and then the borders, not only of the country, but also other political borders that are within the country, which I'll speak to you about in a minute. But what I really intended for the book to be, and I hope that whoever has read it gets this bit, is that I wanted to show that creative resistance and response that people had. And I was more interested in not wallowing in the kind of the trauma and violence and the stories of that, although these are included in the work, but it was really trying to tease out how people creatively responded to these moments of violence. I was going to bring a lot of the work as well, but it's all included in the Ruptured Domesticity website if you go and have a look. The exhibition that I did at LSE involved all of those, which I call trauma books. So every single story, and there are 15 of them because I spoke to 15 Iraqis from across the country, every single one of them is a trauma book, and every single one is a narrative narrated by the person, but also all of the photographs and other bits and pieces that are involved in every single one of those books is donated, given to the project by the participants. So I will come to the different types of violence and traumas that were involved in the work. But really, to kind of summarize what it is, it's not just the war and violence which contributed to the destruction and inevitably the attempts at reconstruction that happened in the country since, but it's also in the really complex kind of mobility networks that happened where people were moving all the time from one place to another. To give you a very small kind of reference point, during the 20 years of violence, Iraq suffered from internal displacement more than any other surrounding neighboring country, than actually of migration. So the displacement was always very much internal. Iraq had its borders blocked off, so people couldn't leave when the invasion happened, and they couldn't leave when the sectarian violence happened after that. So every single movement was pretty much internal, and there was a lot of it. So not every single person that I spoke to, their families moved multiple times within that. So this network of mobility is also part of those trauma geographies. So they're not just one physical space kind of. You can't attribute a spatiality to it because of the differences of time, space, and the movement within that. And then I also, part of the trauma geographies is how people responded to this violence is through the creation of refuge spaces, which I will explain and how that came about. So those two concepts come through the whole book from the beginning to the end. The word rupture, which I use with an ing suffix towards the end, and it's intentional because it's continuous and it's never stopping. It really framed everything about the work that I was trying to do. It had the interpretation of it and the framing of it had this duality, but also multiplicity beyond just the dual two-dimensionality of the opposite to the familiar and unfamiliar. And what it was, anything that is caused by trauma is responded to by also inflicting trauma, whether it's on space, a place, whether it's on the kind of the lives of the everyday lives of people as well. And this was that idea that refuge can have that dialectic relationship and expression. That is one side of it is that trauma and destruction, and the other side is the placemaking that people were trying to kind of engage with and do. And this is the second bit is the bit that really brings out a lot of the work that I did with the people themselves. Then there is this refuge-making, which is the kind of the beyond the making of home, the more than inhabitation and dwelling, the more than, which is referenced in my book as well, the more than that sense of agency to make something. There was also a loss of agency, of course, to a lot of it, but it's the active. In all of these, there is an active resistance to perish, basically, and how people were trying to engage with the world around them, which was always changing all the time. So this constructive versus destructive force to a sense of refuge was very instrumental in the framing of a lot of the work that I was talking about. Before I get into a little bit more of the kind of nuts and bolts of how I did things, I brought in a timeline, a very long timeline. Starts in 1917. Just to give you an idea, Iraq was colonized by Britain way back, and it was part of the League of Nations. Then there was an established monarchy, and then the monarchy collapsed. And there was a reoccupation also by Britain of Iraq during the 40s. I was born in during the Iraq-Iran War. Well, actually before that. I was born just before that. And I've lived through all of those that followed on this page, from the Iraq-Iran War, the Gulf War, the US bombing. US bombed Iraq several times. Probably people know less about the bits in the middle and know a bit more about the Gulf War, which is the 1990 and the 2003. But there were quite few bits and pieces that every single president that ruled in the state ended up sending troops to Iraq at one point or another. But Iraq did not stop having violence by 2003. And what followed was a sectarian violence that happened between the Sunni and the Shia in Iraq, mainly in Baghdad. And then it kind of radiated across and reverberated across the country. And then there was this power vacuum when ISIS took hold of the north of Iraq, and that was followed by a very peaceful and an amazing revolution that also was completely hit with both COVID and the Iraqi government at the time. And that was still happening as we speak, this proxy and ally kind of war in the region. To the left side of this, there is a map of Iraq. It's not exactly the map that you would see in your Google kind of maps. It shows more so what's happening in the middle. So this whole region, which is basically ancient Mesopotamia, which shrank between the two rivers, and then it also shows the expansion of the Kurdish region, and of course it bridges and it crosses multiple different countries, not just the north of Iraq, also North Syria and South Turkey, as well as Iran. So I'm originally from here, but my ancestors are from this part of the country, which is kind of southern Mesopotamia. And I have a Sumerian blood in me, which is brilliant. I've done a DNA test, and it actually came as 89% Mesopotamian. So you are speaking to a Mesopotamian. But what is really interesting about this map is those lines, the dotted lines that cross. So although there was this one country at one point when Saddam was ruling the country, the fact is, past that, when the regime fell, these lines started to emerge as political borders, political lines that meant that they were changing a lot of not only the urban context of the cities that are part of this, but also dissecting and changing that whole political urbanity of the country. This is a strong Shia hold in the south of Iraq. This is a strong Kurdish hold in the north. And what's in the middle is really bits, and you can see this is all desert. So there is not much going on in here. So this is where kind of life is within the country. So it's pretty much still a dissected and very challenged context. My intentions were to be able to speak to as many people from across the country. And I don't think I would have been able to make it to do that had I traveled, to Iraq, because it was, for security reasons, I wouldn't have been able to go from north to south and be able to kind of engage in that space in this way. So when COVID happened and we were kind of pushed to do this online, it was actually enabling that more of a plasticity of being able to connect and communicate with people from across the country. So I'm originally from the center, from Baghdad, from the main city, and just to give you a kind of a little glimpse of how I grew up. You've just seen that timeline of lots of wars. This is the main airport in the city, which was always the first thing to be hit in every single strike. This is called the Green Zone, which is basically where all of the central government in Baghdad sit, but also it was labeled the Green Zone because it was the only international place that was where the occupying forces, but also all of their allies, stayed. And this is Abu Ghraib, for those of you who have heard of Abu Ghraib prison, which is a notorious prison. In 2003, the Americans posed with detainees there, and it was one of the biggest scandals in history. But people kind of forget. So we were right in the middle of this, and the kind of the life that that I grew up in. As a person who is always in that space of danger, it was, I've always looked around me, and I still do when anything happens. So fireworks, you jump and you look around you. And it was one of those things where my fascination with maps started and began during that time. As I was an architecture student back home, and I was really interested in trying to wayfind places of safety very quickly mentally. So I wasn't really drawing those maps, but I was trying mentally to understand how we can get out of there in the middle of all of the bombing, but also knowing that the invasion, when it started on the ground, happened through that main route, which is the Abu Ghraib route. It is also the only route for you to get out of Iraq from that side of the capital through to Jordan, which is the only open border that we ended up having later on after the fall of the regime. So we had those kind of lots of points of trauma, but also points where I was trying to find ways out within this. We ended up going to my uncle's house, which is around here, when it was quite intense. It wasn't that much better, but it was that being with another family. And a lot of people who I spoke to reported this thing of the being together meant that there is a sense of relief from what was going on. I'm going to kind of give you glimpses of those kind of moments of discussions and conversations that I had with people. I don't call them interviews, and a lot of the work that I do isn't an interrogation. The questions were shared with the people that I was working with beforehand. They could have answered or not any of the questions that I asked. It was mainly a storytelling exercise, but also for me, because I was part of the context that they were speaking about, it was also them asking me questions about how and what did we do and where did we go and so on. But it was moments like this. So this is from a person in the north of Iraq, in Kurdistan, when we thought that the Kurds have helped the Americans in the north of Iraq. So presumably all of Kurdistan was absolutely fine. And weren't bombed or they weren't affected. the fact is that these kind of moments where you speak to them and you find out that they actually had a similar type of trauma, but coming at it from a different angle. So this was a trauma that they've had in a massacre in 1988 when Saddam gas bombed part of the Kurdish region because they were trying to retaliate against his rule. And every single one of them remembered that time. So when the regime fell, but they couldn't find Saddam, all of that time between the fall of the regime and the capture of the whole government officials, they were in this state of continuous threat and trauma, although there wasn't anything happening outside. So it was, she was also describing to me, she was saying the birds were singing, everything was fine, outside it was sunny, yet we were sat inside with those handmade, cotton wrapping, those coal within that so that they can make a mask-like to use, and they were just sitting in corners waiting for this retaliation to come, which never came. But what was really interesting within this is that as everyone was reading everyone's stories, those moments of friction, of empathy that happened across, which never existed. So part of the conversations that I had was also the findings that came out of those kind of crossovers between those. The kind of the depictions of those moments of trauma is an interpretation. So I was drawing as they were speaking to me, and part of those moments of trauma were interpreted in a kind of an expressive design. There is also this layering of trauma that happened across the country. So it doesn't start in one place, it doesn't end in one place. With the eradication of ISIS, which did happen from the north of Iraq, post-ISIS, Mosul, which is the biggest city in the north of Iraq that was completely destroyed by ISIS, as well as the battle to kind of eradicate them, meant that people stayed with those scars and are living still with those scars. So this was one of the pieces that we were talking about. Ali Baroudi, a friend of mine, but also one of the people that I've interviewed for the work, he was going around all of those houses in old Mosul, which were never people didn't go back to, even though for those of you who read Arabic, it says Amin, which means it's safe. People were going in, the demining teams were going in to check and then asking people to go back to their homes, but people weren't trusting this thing. So even though there is a tick, it's safe, go back, people were still not going back to those places. And a lot of that struggle comes over years of violence, and this is where this palimpsestic type of trauma comes into being. I also worked with people from Sinjar, which is the region that basically had a genocide inflicted. That is the one genocide that we can actually say it's genocide, unlike the other genocide that is actually genocide, that is not that we're not allowed to mention. This was a genocide, happened in 2014, and for 10 years on, and we've been working with people from the north of Iraq in the Yazidi, from the Yazidi community in the north of Iraq. Kimball is there, my research partner on the project. They're still there. They're still in limbo. They're still in camps. And they have been in camps for 10 years since ISIS invaded their villages and killed as well as destroyed all of their homes. So there is there's a lot of scales to that violence, and I did mention the material culture earlier on. And this is a story from someone who was talking about how when the occupation happened, and you can see me also going back and forth in time. There is no linearity in the time frame of any of those traumas, because traumas do that as well as memory. There is no one line that you can start and finish with as a story. So a lot of the work that we were trying to tease out was following those moments and spaces, without us trying to even understand whether there is a logic to the order. I wasn't also looking, when I was speaking to people, I wasn't really looking for whether what they're telling me is truth or not. I was not trying to get into any level of that, because that was not part of it. What was part of it is for them to actually be able to speak. A lot of the people that I interviewed, the first thing when I said to them what was good about what we're doing, they said, for the first time, we feel that someone is listening. Iraq suffers from a taboo on trauma, so people don't like to talk about it, and they tell their children as well as their relatives not to speak of the traumas that happen, which means people have it like inside and they don't get it out, and they feel that moments like this is when they're listened to. They feel that the outside world isn't listening to them. A lot of what happened in Iraq during the start of the fall of the regime in 2003 and the occupation was social media and mobile phones. So there was not a lot of documentation of what was going on, but there was also no voice other than what the media showed you on television. And it was very much one of the issues that I really wanted to find out, is those intimate moments of trauma that no one has heard about. We've heard about how the invasion happened and how the collapse of the regime happened and so on. But those moments, like, for example, when she was telling me that they felt the intrusion of violence on so many different scales, including that intimate scale where they had to put their underwear in black plastic bags, because they were basically looking everywhere and making a mess in those houses that they were raiding to check for insurgents and plans for insurgencies across. So I used mapping to enable all of these shifts and changes and moves and swivels that are incredibly and inherently kind of non-linear, but also not fixed in one form of spatiality or another. So all of those are what makes the spatial practice that I speak about in the work, but also all of these are the moments where refuge comes to light as well. These are some of the examples of the maps that I did with people. So when you look at every single map, you will see that there are some form of geography, but also there are other bits and pieces within that are very personal objects. And when you look and see the tracing of those red lines with numbers, it's how many movements and shifts about that they had to do. So refuge making within the work that I do is like a homing kind of practice. And I love that phrase, homing, that Paolo Bucani mentions. It's in a different context, on the context of refugee and migrants, but it definitely transfers very well to the work that I do. But I add to it, it's not just about a place in the making and as a becoming, it's also an act of resistance. And there are so many forms of resistance that happened within the work. And I will mention this because it's also made the book cover. So the book cover is very personal. I have a lot of personal stories within the work, but they are not written from an individual. There is something about the personal that is also relational to other stories that happen. So I use autoethnography as one of the kind of the methods that I do, because a lot of those stories I lived. So this is a very personal map as well. This is the blanket that I left Iraq with on that road, the notorious road that crosses through the prison. And that blanket, which became the background for the face of the book, that strip, it's a single kind of person a blanket, it's a small blanket. But my mum, if you can see the seams here, you will see that the seam is kind of been picked by hand. My mum put money for me in there. I left Iraq by car because there weren't any airplanes at the time. And it was me and a driver and two other people who were neighbors, but also extended relatives that we knew. And they had two of the children who were leaving the same time as me. And she put the money there to keep it safe, because she said, if you get ambushed, and there were lots of ambushes going around, lots of gangs, because when the regime fell, there was a collapse of order in the country, like any other place in the world. So it was that place that once was the comfort when I was a child, and it became definitely that moment of, well, a place of resistance within a material resistance within the work. So it made, it's overlaid with the map of Baghdad on top of it. So that's the book cover. Other kind of forms of resistance came in so many different ways. When Iraq was occupied, there was this distribution, which is haphazardly done, of what was called the walling strategy, that the occupying forces decided to scatter across the main capital city in every single place. These blocks were manufactured and produced in the north of Iraq by a Kurdish company which made a ton of money. And when I traced, because I was trying to understand, because they were removed and changed all the time, when I was trying to understand where they ended up, some of them ended up in that deserty bit in the west of the country, but the rest was transferred to Israel to take and put in Palestine. So some of these blocks, concrete blocks, have been transferred there. But what was really kind of not just sinister, I think the word is sinister. What was really sinister about those walls is that they emerged and existed all of a sudden. They popped up in the middle of the night. And then for security reasons, they were changed also in the middle of the night. So those openings that you see here, and you can see that very important taxi. So the taxis were communicating with each other across streets, saying, I'm carrying, a family of 5 with me. I'm going to drop them off near that opening entrance, and I need you, the other taxi, to take them to another place. And it was really, what I was really interested in is all of those creative ways where Iraqis were trying to kind of cope with this imposed violence on their city. What was sinister about them is that they changed constantly overnight, and they did for years, because the occupying forces were trying to dismantle any strategic kind of planning from insurgents to use where those places are, where, and the directives of all of the openings to, kind of have bomb attacks or whatever coming out of it. And people were opening their doors, sometimes seeing those walls right in front of them where they couldn't even send their kids to school. And they had to kind of go around the block of houses in order for them to reach one place or another. But I was really, I was captivated by people's quick response to trying to find solutions to those moments. And the last one was really this bigger place of resistance that happened in the square. Iraq has a Tahrir Square, just like many Arab countries around it. Maybe less well known than the Tahrir Square and other places, but it did. And it had a revolution in 2019, which was timed exactly the same time as the Lebanese revolution as well. And they were actually, this is the moment where cross-border resistance started to kind of come even more strongly. I remember a lot of friends that I had who were on the square being in constant contacts with people in Lebanon who were on the ground as well, protesting. Two other final examples of how people are trying to kind of emerge out of the ashes and resist those traumas that they're living in. So this is one of the projects which was done by one of the most famous Iraqi architects in modernist kind of period, Rupturing Architecture. The building had to come down because it was rendered into what you see behind you, behind the musicians. But it was used as this place of trauma. ISIS used it to basically chuck people who they accused of homosexuality, they basically anyone who they don't like, from the top of the, and we see similar patterns of similar kind of behavior. IDF has used similar type techniques in Palestine as well. The other one is, this is a group of people that we worked with on the last project with the Yazidis, and he is the one who's basically, Nouri has put together all of that Sinjar Academy, film academy, which is, out of nothing. They just literally had one projector and they came together and started doing this thing. It's amateurs trying to kind of resist what is going on in the world around them. All of those people live in camps, as in tarpaulin camps, campsites in the country. And I'm going to end with this, which is how the book ends. The book ends with a call to action, but also a kind of a voice to the unheard and the ungoogleable and those things that don't exist and you don't know about. And it kind of celebrates that creative kind of making and refuge making, but it also puts into perspective this plurality of that making, in particular what I call that refuge making. And it kind of pushes for justice, participation, as well as sustainability and resilience to come together in those spaces. And that's how we've been working, as well as pretty much a lot of what we do is through co-design and co-creation with people. That is a discount code from Bloomsbury for the hardcover of the book. I don't have copies of the book on me. It's incredibly expensive at the moment, so I don't advise any of the students to go and buy one. It will come down when it comes in paperback, and it will be much cheaper and much more manageable. But this code gets you 35% discount on what is now an eye-watering £85 hardcover book. So I'm not doing the selling justice, but I don't believe that an £85 book should be bought by anyone ever. So that's me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll stay a little short, but I hope we can have a conversation before opening to the floor. I haven't plotted anything despite a lot of notes that I have, but this is the way.
Ad-libbed.
Exactly. So I'll go a little bit random, and I also prepare some questions, maybe to engage in a sort of conversation. But first of all, let me say that it's super interesting to, and I thank you very much, and thanks Giovanna and everybody, to having been engaged into the book. But I think engaging into the book in different ways, not only through the readings, but also through the fact that probably, or actually, I'm sure that your book and your work signify a sort of very fundamental and important actual moment of rethinking the discipline and the practice of architecture, but also combining different stages and different territory through which architecture has been engaging into. And actually, it's quite provocative that comes at this very moment, to a certain extent, condensing, as you said, 10 years or more of work, which normally happens in books, but then you struggle with both the prices of the book and the pages to make everything into the 10 years. So thank you very much for that. The second thing that I want to thank you very much is because we got to the point about thinking refuge beyond refuginess, and I think this is something that to a certain extent is both very central to getting outside to a certain extent to forced migration framing, but also to rethink the fundamental issues that we were taught in architecture, at least for those who went to an architectural training, or that the refuge is the fundamental element of architecture. So I think the double struggle or the double agency that you are shaping within the research, although physically and historically and geographically grounded in Iraq, so in a very specific territory, are actually very much useful to displace the tension between the foundation and something others or ontological that you would say. There are a lot of very interesting things in the book, and you went through very much the core of it, which is not a word that you use, and partially is a question, which is the archive. And I had the senses when I was reading the book before that you were trying to both archiving and non-archiving in a both moment, in the kind of in the same moment. And I'm not sure if I read it correctly, but is one of the very interesting books that you see, yes, it's very costly. Yes, it's very hardcore in the sense that hardcore cover, but it's also part of an exhibition, part of a teaching material, and part of other things. And what I'm saying is that the book is more than a book and is weaved to a series of other tools of your intellectual background, intellectual project, but also the continuous engagement with the practice, whatever practice of research in the field. And I think that is very interesting in a book that actually is a book that shows about part of the exhibition, and the exhibition is part of the book, but the book is part of the material that you teach, and then ends with the manifesto. So there is quite a different language that are, for everybody somehow as a target. So one of the questions I had was, sometimes we write books for ourselves, but we think to communicate those things to someone. And I was wondering who the target was. And you mentioned some part of your presentation that the target was both you and yourself to a certain extent, so giving credit to the memory of the places you went through and the different elements of that. And I think this is very strong in some part of the book, where the tonality gets actually more intimate. And I appreciated a lot the fact that is a difficult book to read. And it's a difficult book to read because despite it's played around all this different material that you actually pack and unpack, you construct and deconstruct, you connect and weave, it's difficult because when you want to get the intellectual component, so this kind of tell me what that is, and give me the quote, the citation of the complex articulation of your reflection, which goes back to Southern theory, which goes to anthropology, which goes to some of the conventional architectural thinking. But then the security of getting some intellectual fundamental theory gets displaced or again challenged with the crude intimacy of some of the texts that you wrote out. And one of the questions that I had was how you manage actually the complexity of not a conventional theorizing from the field and not a conventional reflecting on concepts that emerge out of ethnography in general, which is a broader terminology, but how you juggle with the violence of the intimacy and the complex fact that any single word meant across a numbers of register, a number of sensible register, psychologically, intellectually, memory-wise to a certain extent. And this makes the book very interesting, but also very difficult to read. And I imagine if it's difficult to read, I imagine it's difficult to write it, in the sense of how to actually sustain that conversation. So what I think the political point for me is central, and then I get into the question. The political point that I have.
I thought the question
had
already
some,
been...
but there are many more. So you have see how many people. You'd asked me to. So this is the question. But I leave some questions here. Maybe there are not questions.
No, but you asked me a question.
So you want to answer?
Do you want me to answer?
Okay, go.
No. Maybe before I lose track. Thank you, Camilla. I think you are absolutely right, and there was a struggle to, and I'm not going to say balance. I think I was in a state of kind of internal violence with the writing, at the same time as trying to honor the stories that I was told, and the responsibility of those Southern narratives to come out in ways that they haven't come out in, before, that I felt the burden of, and that kind of marrying between how do you, the weave between where do you pause to give those kind of theoretical nuggets and conceptual kind of framings, and how do you kind of still give that space for people to read. I did not mention this, by the way. The book, which I argued with Bloomsbury on for quite some time, but then they agreed to it. The book has lengthy quotes from the conversations that I had with people. And they came back to me saying, these are it's very unconventional for you to have a page and a half worth of a narrative story from someone, and then, another page and a half from someone else, and so on. And I said, this is all incredibly intentional. There is a lot of meat around it from a conceptual kind of perspective, but it was intentional that they are given the space, and it's not a footnote or a little mention to their existence within the book. The 15 had a say in even the kind of the teasing out of the findings within the manifesto later on. So all of those things, and it was never linear. Even the process of actually having those conversations with them wasn't just a one-time thing. We were always on WhatsApp. There was always this thing, and I forgot to tell you about this, and let's set up another Zoom meeting, let's have another conversation. So there was a lot of this back and forth and going in and out of those moments that meant that at any one given time when I was writing, I was also trying to show what they really wanted me to. And a lot of those stories were picked out by the people themselves. So there were things that drove the conversation in writing and in the questions that were driven by the people that I worked with. And there were things that were driven because, like you mentioned, there is this struggle within us as kind of architectural kind of practitioners, but also theorists and critics, to look at and critique these moments where we take architecture beyond the kind of static representation of what it is, and it's also part, beyond the formality of the spaces that people were also describing and talking about. A lot of the references, and in fact a lot of the interested parties, I must also say this, and I say it to a lot of audiences that I speak to, I have been engaging with anthropologists, criminologists, all kinds and sorts of people from every single background, refugee studies, migration studies, and so on, and very much less so with architects, or in a conventional kind of sense. My work really doesn't sit within that space, and I have potentially, because of that interdisciplinarity to it, also the book represents that kind of struggle with being situated within that field, within our field, and I kind of embraced it towards the end. I felt that if I am going to do this, I need to go out with a bang. I'm not writing another book for the coming 5 years. I'm going to write a manifesto on spatial justice, and I'm going to call that a field, and I'm going to do it, And it was partly because I felt a vacuum in our own profession, our own practice, our own kind of ways of working, that really was enabled by those conversations that I had, but also enabled by all of those different methods that I used. The erraticness of bringing those things together was part of the violence that the book was dealing with. So the violence isn't just imposed, is also created in a way within the pages. That struggle was integral to the work. So if it came through with a kind of a pinch of humanity to those stories, then this is really what I wanted it to do.
Excellent. Thank you very much. There's another part which is the core of your reflection, which touch and is inevitable that touch to my work or the work that I'm doing at the moment, which is very much the idea of refuge. But for us, at least Joanne and I, the idea of going towards an excess version of was definitely, and thank you very much for that, and resonate very clearly, and we see the combination of that, and I think is beautiful. But I want to throw an element into that, which is, if I understood correctly, the idea of refuge and the kind of a dual version of that, the ambivalence I would have called of that. I have the impression that we should somehow cross it or test it with a kind of a present condition. Mm-hmm. And I have the impression that the present condition of violence across a number of registers, not including conflict and war, but specifically the violence of some forms of capitalisms that is connected to and actually structural to the war, the violence of the war, state or non-state. I have the impression that the deliberate construction of what I call inhabitation, so the fact that it's impossible inhabitation, has been moved to another level of stage, which is render impossible the possibility even of the refuge. And I want to get your senses into that, because the long story and the long spatial stories, the trajectory, even if it's not long and linear, that you are tracing, to me are putting a sort of an emergence, stop with the present recent conditions across the globe, and not necessarily only in Middle East, where is not only the case of destroying, of destruction, of violence, of partitions, of annihilation in general, but is even more intended to construct a true impossibility of safe zones, a true impossibility of livability. And I wonder whether if this kind of version is what I call is actually deprive us the possibility of refuge. And this is both too, you might remember, I was recently looking for covers for a presentation. There was an Economist covers of Economist cover of the journal, where this penguin in the middle of nothing with no safe space. Now, of course, you cannot translate a geography into that and topic into that, but I wondered, so my point is double. There is a limit to the romanticization, and it's not a negative connotation that I'm doing at all, to the creative construction which is constantly present but immanent violently into that, limited, fractured, incomplete, fugitive today would have said, into the construction of that possible of refuge that is actually not constructing the refuge ontologically. So what if, at the end, is not actually that the human condition, the ontological human condition, the anthropological human condition is nothing that a struggle, that is a constant struggle to find a refuge. So, and I wonder whether this resonates with the fact that this goes out of the pure architectural meaning, in the sense that, withdraw the architectural responsibility to do the refuge because it's embedded into forms of. So, and I mean, this was a sort of reflection that I was doing from the place that I'm researching at the moment, not necessarily a connection that I have with your work, but your work speaks very much to this impossibility of the refuge that I discovered that, which is constantly imperfect, because the project of life that the annihilation is actually constructing, the deliberate annihilation of violence, is continuously producing that. And so the idea of trauma, to a certain extent, is actually constructing a sort of continuous traumatic present, which is actually not anymore traumatic, because the very notion of trauma is abandoned as an event logic, but became a sort of longer ontological. So, and this for me was super central, but it's also opened the idea of a very political dimension, for two reasons, and this is the question. There is no return out. There is no safe or salvific version of the project. Any design project is not a salvific solution to that. It's always some forms of compromise, negotiation, frictional, the terminology has been varied in your work. But it's also a no return in the sense of a fixity. There is no before, there is never an after. And therefore, the question that I have is what the future, if architecture is always looking to the future. And the second part is on the home. Because if refuge and home, if the refuge is the impossible, what is the non-home that is in there? So the question is going to the anthropology and the memory and the stuff. So is it possible to actually make this idea of refuge as a phenomenon, as a concept, as an element that actually question the very idea of displacement and actually put our condition, human condition, differently perceived, of course, into an era of unsettlement rather than an era of settlement. And I think that is a political dimension that actually put in crisis or critique of the humanitarian system, put in critique a political system of refuge, and put in critique the very notion of design as curative and reparative as... So what? That's my question.
It's So I come at it at exactly that point from a different angle in the book when I explain the conditions of trauma and memory and how they operate within the violence that I speak about. And they both have in their characteristics exactly what you just described, which means that it is indeed true. You cannot repair, but you can also not return back. There are loads of projects and examples inside the book, especially in chapter 4 actually, where it speaks about how time warps all of those notions within the kind of the desire to reconstruct and the questioning of what to do with those buildings where ISIS chucked people from top of the roof. Shall we rebuild the same building? Shall we destroy Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, other places in the world have got exactly the same questions around that notion of, do we repair? Does the repair actually return back anything? Or is it never going in that direction? But actually, the fact that these moments where I talk about refuge and not a physical kind of entity and move beyond that into this relationship between the ontology of trauma and spatial violence, but also in memory, whether it's collective or whether it's individual, and how these are also the retelling of stories through the recalling of memory is also fragmented and non-linear and never returns to. This is why I was never interested in finding the real stories of what happened, because there is no real in that sense. And in a very similar sense, there is no one physicality that we should call a home or a refuge. And those come in different entities. And that was when also partly supported by a lot of the kind of conversations that I had with people, where they were referring to refuge in the moments when they got their family in a car and drove away, and they were talking about refuge on the move, as well as refuge within static kind of entities. And this is the kind of the moment where I do reference your work and Giovanna's on this more than an habitation. It's not a dwelling. There is no sense of wanting to stop at one kind of level and say, I'm satisfied with where I am right now. It's always happening, and it's always on the move, and it's always kind of changing. And that instability, I find there is a lot of fragility, but there is also an incredible amount of intimacy that come from those fragile moments. What was your second?
No.
I don't know.
Can move on.
We can
Maybe
move on.
It's okay.
We can have a chat.
Still have
with
time
a
or
drink later.
open to? So I'm consciously the time. So I'm 25. So one.
Yeah.
Palimpsest and manifesto.
Yes.
I
love them.
I know
Both.
that you love them, but they're also part of a very conventional architectural traditions to a certain extent. Corbeau, the manifesto, the layering of the manifesto. Everybody has a manifesto. So you have a huge responsibility now with the manifesto. And I'm kind of putting as an opening again in terms of the idea of the language and the kind of contra narrative that you were doing. the idea of the multiplicities of different narrative, the plurality, the different scales, the unresolved tensions, and you have these beautiful things about, it's not a dialectical that you are always constructive, but a sort of plurality in difference. And for me, are unresolved tension between internal and external, domesticity, tension between exposure and protection. There's a numbers of different things, climate in the landscape. But then, in where I get methodologically the palimpsest in terms of this kind of infinite, non-finite, broken mirror, there is no risk. What are the risks of the manifestos to a certain extent have you found any risks into defining the manifesto, and why you came with this shift to kind of an affirmative way versus something that is more critical and inquiry? And I'm curious about that as a way to say that I think is a good lines of direction, but I'm curious about the next step. And you said that you're not writing anything for the next 5 years, which I strongly encourage you not to do, because you have to write. But
not a book. Not a book.
But,
I'm writing already.
But maybe. So how this is related actually to the next part of the book? A book never ends; it actually starts with something else. And I'm wondering how the manifesto is helping you actually to translate or move to.
The simple answer is to why a manifesto, and it's a very conventional architectural kind of proposition, and in a sense, the content of it isn't traditional architectural proposition, of course, but yes, the concept of and the idea of a manifesto. It was intentional because I felt, as I was writing and reading and rewriting, that the book needed an element of hope, a moment that drags the reader out of the misery of the content, because it is miserable, and a lot of the content is incredibly heavy, traumatic, kind of side to it, and bring it into a place that distills a little bit of hope, not only in the reader, but whoever wants to use this as a tool, because I use it as a tool. So I use a manifesto, but I also create a kind of in a way, a tool within that. How did that? It was, as I was writing the last part of it, I got another AHRC, as one does, which was this project. And the manifesto enabled a toolkit of a trauma-informed policy to drive a specific part of the project, but within a specific context. And it was then that I saw that link. To begin with, I thought a lot of what the manifesto would enable is practitioners to start to work with people on the ground in a more meaningful way. But then it enabled the project, the second project, to really start to test those kind of tools, and in a lot of ways, it actually did achieve those kind of moments of hope within that. There is a spin-off to this, which is in the making at the moment. So potentially, you will see that not only the manifesto ends in a policy and a toolkit, but also there is a driving kind of relationship to circle back at ways of critically looking at those tools. So that's a kind of where I'm going with this next. But it was also to kind of pay a little bit of homage to this relationship, the kind of the really unsettling relationship that I have with my profession, with my field, with architecture, where I never felt that I truly belong because of all of the other things that I do. But at the same time, I've always kind of looked at it from a little window and peered at some of the changes that happen through it, and went like, oh, I'm glad I'm not really there, you know, in a sense. But I've always had that sense of awkward kind of conversation. And I kind of felt that a manifesto would do, because it has the characteristics that relate immediately to what a manifesto does. Everyone knows what you need to do with a manifesto. So I needed something that would very clearly and imminently end on a high, the book that has quite a lot of heaviness to it. And yeah, that's why it ended that way.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for engaging with the conversation in different moments, and I have my share in asking you very interesting question, and thank you. So maybe more to come.
We can take a few questions.
Yeah,
from
sure.
So, you want to start? No questions? No questions.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question about your positionality during the research process, because you have many hats. You are a researcher, architect, even not Iraqi, and also someone who has from that country. So how was your experience doing interviews and also preparing the...
But take one by one, or
yeah, up to you. You tell me what you want
Do you have
to.
more questions? Maybe we take two, and then we also have a couple of time, so I would take
So just to kind of briefly explain my positionality, I guess. So I'm a doctor by background, but I've worked in a few IDP camps outside Mosul, which were mostly for people who had left Mosul when it was being retaken, so they were living under ISIS during the, and so that was they were mostly quite conservative Sunni populations, which gave me a certain insight into and I guess intimacy with that kind of insight. But I was just wondering, in your book, do you get perspectives from people in camps, and what was the experience? What was the difference of experiences, and do you have any reflections on that? And I guess maybe broader reflections on the kind of the roles of IDP camps and these international NGOs. And then also, if I can tag on another question quickly. So I went to maybe last month or the month before a talk at KCL about Yazidis and kind of a rebuilding of Sinjar. And there was discussion about kind of UNITAD and the failure of some of the legal processes. But one thing that was mentioned was how, I can't remember the precise building in Mosul, but as part of the reconstruction of the old city in Mosul, there had been some reflection that actually that process had been really, in bringing together different communities, Sunni, Yazidi, etc., in that one space. That was actually a really positive and much more constructive than what the NGOs were doing, sitting everyone in a room and trying to hash it out. And so I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about kind of this process of kind of redevelopment or kind of reconstruction as a reconciliation process.
They are connected, so I'm going to speak about the group of people and how. So the fact that I speak the language, as well as I've lived some of the stories that they're telling, meant that there was a very quick trust building that happened with the group of people that I was working with. And I speak about it a lot in the book, where I speak about my positionality as a researcher, but also as an inside researcher working from outside, and what that means to doing research, and how it's perceived, how I'm perceived, my intentions, and all of that. And this is why a lot of the conversations that I had needed to start with the way that we have conversations in Iraqi and Arabic. And every single one of the people that I spoke to, I had several phone calls and conversations with to have a relationship with, to get to know them before we even started doing recording for the interviews that I did. And all of that, I knew it's going to take time, and I knew it's incredibly, it was not only time consuming, but the vicarious trauma that came through all of those conversations that I had was also incredibly high. But I knew that I had a responsibility towards their stories and needed to make them feel that although I am on the outside, I'm still part of this conversation, and I want to show them that I was incredibly involved, but also interested in hearing how they coped. So there is a lot in that friction of where do you stand, and how do you perceive yourself, how do they perceive you. A lot of them did say to me that you're an outsider, because I am, in a way, an outsider, and they kind of felt that they could have probably had not a similar relationship, but not that far different of a relationship with someone who is a foreigner to the country who's doing similar research. But no one had asked them. So that was a thing that definitely the book starts with a very personal statement where I kind of bring all of that out, because I felt that it directed a lot of those conversations, definitely. Coming to the series of questions that you had, which was, yes, I did, and it was the difference between speaking to people. So all of the people that I've spoke to in Iraq were still in Iraq, apart from a couple of people who had left the country. One of them had come to this country seeking asylum, and she was still waiting for the process. Actually, she's just got her refugee status after 7 years, but when at the time of the writing, she was still waiting. And then another one who had left the country and went back, and then left again and went back. So she was traveling. But all of the others were inside Iraq and never left. The two people that I spoke to who were in the camps, and the people who I spoke to who were in Mosul, who obviously were multiple times displaced, speak of this efforts of reconciliation and trying to kind of understand that space happening much more than the south of Iraq, for example, or the middle. And I think it's because of the complexity of the not only political but the social makeup of the communities that are in the middle and in the south compared to the north. And yes, there was a huge difference between those who were in camps, of course, because they were still living those moments of being displaced. They were living in camps, still not being able to kind of return back, but also they were still feeling those moments of violence against them, especially the Yazidis, because they were worried about persecution from other groups of people, not just ISIS after the eradication of ISIS. So there was definitely there was a lot of that going on. Mosul was the only city that had any reconsideration of kind of consultation with the public on what to do to the city, how to rebuild parts of it. Baghdad had none of that. And it's much more volatile and messy still in the capital and the south. So there is no stability and in fact, we don't have UN organizations working much in the south, and they're all in the north because there is a bit of safety, because there is the blanket of being looked after by the Kurds. So there is a lot of that dynamics and politics that play a huge role in how much of the involvement of the stability that could start to look at reconciliation efforts and working with communities and rehabilitation and all of those ethics of care and repair and so on come into play compared to the South. And I do again touch on that within the work, because I use the North as a case study compared to the South within and talk about the divides between them.
Sana, there are two questions online. Maybe you have already covered part of it, but I'm going to read them nevertheless. So the first one is coming from Syria, so online attendees from Syria, asking, what are the post-war spatial practices representing people's attempts to rekindle themselves with their London cities? And the second one is, was there an experience concerning the resettling of citizens in affected regions? Did they feel safe and secure after returning to their homes?
There are so many little nuggets of love that are happening within particular communities, and it's happening across the country. And it is efforts by little small organizations who are working between them, basically. Efforts happening across the country. But they're small organizations, mainly self-funded. The government isn't interested in supporting a lot of this activism, and they have driven a lot of that activism away from outside the country as well. So there are, but they are struggling to cope and work, and we're trying to work with a couple of them as well. So there is a British Academy funding that we just got, and not British Academy, so British Council funding that we just got with the LSE Middle East Centre, with one of those organizations in the south of Iraq, to work with women who basically, again, the voices of women in the south is incredibly marginalized. So we're trying to work, and it's on climate change and what's going on. In terms of rebuilding, it's very difficult to say of anything that is happening that is organized in the country. There is an erratic sense of development sporadically popping up in several places. There is a lot of money that is going not to the right hands, and there is a lot of corruption still. So there isn't a great deal of organized efforts within the rebuilding, within that space. And this is 20 years from now. So I dread to think what would happen to the rest of the region, which is still in pieces. But the second question was on
resettling citizens.
Yes. So there is a very difficult situation which happened in Iraq when the regime fell, and there was looting and there was a lot of mess with the collapse of power, and there was also a lot of destruction of archives, of papers, of everything that was going on. So Iraq lost a lot of those kind of legislative kind of evidence that actually allows people to return and have ownership over their homes. Besides, a lot of those people, some of them returned, some of them couldn't return because their homes were destroyed, or their homes were occupied by people who moved on from other kind of places. And those repercussions happened across the country. And you see it now in so many parts of the country where, again, we've spoken about this phrase, the informal settlements. There are so many of those self-built, places that are happening across cities and on the peripheries because a lot of the internal places are still not resolved for people to return back to. So I think if we want to look at mobility post 2003 in Iraq, it's incredibly difficult to map, and there is very little return that happened without a very clear identity attached to it. So for example, the Yazidis did manage to return back to some of the villages or to Sinjar itself in the north of Iraq, because the community itself was predominantly Yazidi. So it was easy for them to return back, even though not to their houses, to some kind of areas where they belonged originally. But that is not the case. It's incredibly homogeneous in the rest of Iraq, especially in Baghdad and the surrounding cities, where this is pretty much impossible for them to do. So the kind of multiple layers of displacement happened and still continuously happening. And people are returning from abroad as well, wanting to also go back to their homes, some of them, and which also poses an incredible amount of difficulty to get all of that.
Do we have more questions?
Hello. I have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna just limit to two. Or a third one is a comment, but I would like your reflection on it. So the first one is, for me, I'm finding it a bit hard to talk about return as a fix of refuge and being a refugee.
Yep.
Because everybody sees it some sort of like, if you're a refugee and you return, then it's a remedy of everything happened, which is not the truth. No. It's actually either a new displacement, whether coerced or voluntarily, or a way of moving forward actually, and like going back and continuing. And or the third thing is now, because I'm Syrian as well, so this quite happening about this peer pressure of return, right? Like, do you want to return? Do you want to rebuild? You were all got out, and you have to go back and rebuild your country. So I'm finding it very hard to grasp when we talk about return here. Why we don't talk about the dark side of return?
Yeah, of course.
And because the rupture that you talk about is not only spatially being plucked out of your location, but also it's about a time rupture. Yeah. That you cannot just go back to continue what it was and what it will be. You have to kind of recapture everything. Which connects to my second one, which is related to seeing refuge is not as a spatial only practice, but also as a time practice. That is actually transitions. It's more of a time enclave which moves with you in space. Especially for people who have multiple displacements, not one of them. Mm-hmm. So how did this appear in your work? Because I noticed that you were talking especially about the North Iraq, the Kurdish person who was talking about recalling traumatic events, and probably her children who never had it in Halabja at the time. She had kind of brought back from her own trauma the material practice of making something, of putting the cloth with to save yourself from a chemical weapon. And I know from a personal experience that a lot of people, even if they were assured that the water is clean, that they will never drink it, because for them it's still chemically poisoned. Mm-hmm. And this is as well also appears again as these spatial practices of material trauma. And how this you keep bringing back, even if you don't know it, is generationally transmitted. So that I would like to know from your work how it happened. And the last thing is, did you, for the quotes, it's in Arabic probably, and for me the translation is a problem. Understanding Arabic is completely different. The word home doesn't exist in Arabic. It exists with something else said, and something else said in a certain way, so you cannot capture it. So for me, that I would love to know, did you put the text together, like in Arabic and English, or did you have with the book production and the minimizing of the papers, you have to stick to one language? So I'm curious about that.
It's a very good point. So definitely, the return is a big entity. Actually, in the book. there is not a lot of mention of return. It's in this project that a lot of that conversation around return, because we were working with a group of Yazidis who are in the north of Iraq, displaced in camps. And obviously that word return means a lot to them and in different ways, because, in a similar way, that is now the spotlight on Syrians. Why don't you return? It is on them as well. You should be returning because ISIS is eradicated, of course. And there is, in a lot of what they said, is give us the option, we want the option. And every single one of them had said, we can't talk about return without giving us the choice. And if you read this booklet, it actually does speak specifically about these. Having the choice of return is a very different thing to asking or talking about return in vacuum to all of that. So I totally and completely agree with you. On the other point, which is this kind of the temporal element to trauma and refuge. And it's absolutely true. And even though I speak, so this is why I like the kind of the encompassing spatial practice, because it does involve the everyday and the making of things that kind of you encounter and the material culture. And it's not just space in its kind of physicality. But time comes into a lot of the work. And in fact, the last chapter is all around how things change over time. Not just buildings, not just events, not just spaces, but also memories and those connections and what they mean. And I do bring in various examples to kind of contextualize this. But I totally agree with you. There is and this is why I never also use the word repair or reconstruction or, because there is no, it's always going to look very different whenever you return back to it. And there is no circling around to the same point, and it's never the same point. So in that sense, this is why a lot of the work is non-linear, and it speaks of refuge as a non-linear entity as well. It could be a temporal, it could be a spatial, it could be a thing that you carry with you, like you said, because it's not. But I did mention before that I don't really use refuge as another connotation of the word home, and in fact, very difficult to interpret from Arabic to English as well. On the translations, very interesting. There is a lot of words that I use in Arabic in here, and I put a kind of the gist of what they mean rather than the literal translation, because the literal translation will never sit right in there. But the interviews and the conversations had to be translated to English. What I did is I translated them the way that they meant rather than the literal kind of translation. And then I returned them back to everyone. Actually, even the non-Arabic speakers had their interviews returned back to them for them to vet and agree with or not. And a lot of changes happened during that time. And there were conversations between those who spoke English who, we argued on, not argued, but, stopped and paused on few words where we say, it's not really, this is not satisfying, it's not the right thing. But we brought it to the closest that we can for it to be read in English. There is an attempt to translate the whole book into Arabic, because there is that, which I'm working with the British Academy who funded the project, to hopefully be able to get the right. But I'm going to have to work with that person, because I've had the introduction translated by an Iraqi, but it was like non-publishable. It lost a lot of the kind of content. So it's a very difficult job, but I'm really interested in doing it because I kind of feel, although the book was intended, and you asked that earlier on, who is it intended for? Although the book was intended for English speakers because it was to get the voices out to the West, in a way. People do want to see it as an archive, in a way, in Arabic as well. So there is this kind of, two ways of looking at it. So it's not one thing or another in terms of purpose and where it sits, in that sense.
So in reality, you are going to do another book
in
the next 5 years. It's going to be another book. I think we are beyond time, so we need to do a close. Thank you for a very wonderful presentation and coming to the DPU. I was saying the ballet to present it. Thank you.